Hello, story lovers, and welcome to another episode of Around the World in 40 Tales. I am delighted to be here today with fellow Storytelling Alberta member, Caroline Stuart. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you. Hi.
Great to be here with you today. Caroline will be telling a story today from Scotland called The Crofter and the Seal Women. But before we dive in, we just want to acknowledge that our program today and all of our Around the World recordings take place on the traditional territories of the Indigenous signatories to treaties 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10. And this land includes the Métis Nation of Alberta and the Métis settlements. So Caroline Stuart started storytelling around the dinner table. She loves to explore heritage stories as well as Scottish, German, and Turkish tales. The old tales, she believes, hold wisdom and show the paths that her ancestors traveled and understood. Caroline uses the old stories to understand her family journey and also to explore where her path differs. Caroline has been telling, listening, and participating with Storytelling Alberta for 30 years and has been on the executive for many of those years.
Yes.
It is such a pleasure for her, she says, to be celebrating 40 years of Storytelling Alberta and how story has touched her life. Thank you so much, Caroline. And I will let you take it away with the Crofter and the Seal Women.
Well, thank you very much, Doreen. And yes, I am so very pleased and feel very honored to be here, to be able to tell a story. To celebrate this 40th anniversary, it's wonderful. So I'm going to tell this tale today of the Crofter and the Seal Woman. And this story, as Doreen said, is from Scotland. And this story, I have it from a book. As you can see, a well-thumbed book, Scottish Myths and Legends. So it's a fairly simple telling of this tale, and I want you to think a little bit about it as I'm telling it, because there's so many levels, even though it's a bit of a simple story. So historically, of course, we can think about what happened when people were taken away from their villages, when they were displaced, what that was like for them, because this story is partly about that. There's also a sense in this story for me about what happens when people in your life, particularly a parent, disappears. Where did they go and what happened? And what happened for the children? One of the things I love about this story is the children they're treated so gently in this story because it's not their fault. So that's also part of this story. But the part that I keep thinking about is the part that's about self and our skin. In essence, what is it when we give away our authentic self, and how do we come back to our authentic self, and what is that in our relationships? So for me, this story, even though it's simple, there are many, many layers and levels of it. And this is one of the reasons that what we as storytellers initially start telling stories from these well-crafted tales, because we learn from them about how to craft story and how to tell story. So I wanted just to start with that. Also to say that Selkies or seal people are actually part of many, many cultures. So the Japanese, all around the Scottish Highlands, also in Canada, there are traditional tales of Selkie. And in fact, in the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, there's one clan who is thought to have started between a Selkie female and one of the clansmen. So it's out there. Selkies are out there. So again, the Crofter and the Selkie woman. There was once a Crofter, and he had a small piece of land where he eked out a meager living. He grew some crops and he was able to have a vegetable garden. And he supplemented his income because he had a boat. And with that boat, he would put lobster and crab pots on the seabed close to the shore. And then he would take that and sell it at market. He had a nice life, but he was lonely. One evening, when he was walking towards the beach where he had his boat tied up, he heard the sound of women's laughter. He stopped, and something told him to be very quiet. The laughter was coming from behind a rocky outcrop. So he crept towards that outcrop, and he peeked over, and he saw the most beautiful women he had ever seen in his life. The women were dancing in the sand. They were dancing and splashing in the water. They were laughing and giggling and enjoying the sun as it went down and the warmth that was on their skin. And he just looked in amazement and wonder at what he was seeing. And he thought, I think there's Selkie. And he looked down in front of him, and there in the rocky outcrop, in fact, were their seal skins. And he just watched. And there was one woman in particular who struck him. She was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. She had big, dark eyes, and her eyes were as black as the night. And her hair tumbled past her shoulders, shimmering in gold. And her skin was almost translucent and pink in the setting sun. And he was transfixed. And he gave his heart to her. The women had no idea he was there, and they danced and laughed and enjoyed themselves until they realized they had to very quickly put on their skins and return back into the ocean. So one by one, they came to the rocky outcrop, and they got their skin and they slipped it over their shoulders, and then they pulled the crowl over top of their head and became seals again and slipped back into the sea. And the last one to come was the beautiful woman that the Crofter loved. And just as she reached for her skin, he grabbed it and he clung onto it tight. She gasped, both in shock and in fright. And the other women, seeing what was happening, called out to her, but they were already seals and they couldn't do anything to help her. And the woman said to him, please, please give me back my skin. I need to return back into the ocean. But he couldn't do it. He held fast to her skin. And his heart said to her, I want to marry you. I want to make a life with you here. And he talked to her and she pleaded and begged, but his heart was hardened towards her. And eventually she realized she could do nothing but go with the Crofter. All the other women had disappeared then into the sea. And as she walked away on that beach, a bull seal raised its head above the water with great sorrow in its eyes and called out to her. For the bull seal was the seal woman's husband. And when they got back to the Crofter promised her things, and he was gentle and he was sweet with her. And still she begged and asked to have her skin back, but he refused. And when she eventually fell asleep, he took that skin and he wrapped it in a blanket and he put it into a box. And he took the box and he took it into his briar and he put it into the deepest, darkest corner and put straw on top of it because he knew she would never find it there. Years passed. The Crofter was very happy with his seal wife. She was lovely, and he loved her with all of his heart. They had 7 children, and he worked very hard, and he made a good living for them. They weren't rich, but they always had everything they needed. And she took his house and she'd made it a home for him and the children. It was filled with warmth and laughter and love. For the seal woman, she was fond of her husband. He was a good man, and she had a deep, deep love for her children. But there had been a time in her life when she was completely happy and content. And no matter what he did for her or the sweet words he had for her, it would never compensate her for her loss. sometimes late at night, when the whole house was still and everyone was sleeping, she'd leave the house and she'd walk down to the ocean and she'd look over those waves in the moonlight and she'd search for the faces of her family and of her true love. One day when the crofter was out working on the fields and the seal woman was in her home in the kitchen, her youngest daughter came to her, and the youngest daughter was holding something, and she had no idea what her mother's past was. She didn't know any of the story, but what she held, she was so curious about because she'd found it in the briar, in a box and in a blanket. And it smelled like the sea, and it was soft and it was warm, and she wanted to know what it was. So she held it out to her mother, and the seal woman took the skin with tears in her eyes. That evening, when the crofter came home, his house was quiet and warm. The children were all in bed and asleep, and there was soup simmering in the fire. But his wife wasn't there to greet him. And then there was no way for him to know what had happened to her. There was no indication of where she might have been. And fear gripped his heart, and he ran out to the briar, and he found it there, found the box, turned over, and the blanket empty. And then he knew. Eventually, the crofter married again, and the woman he married loved him with all of her heart. And the crofter was very happy with her. He was content. And she raised his children as though they were her own. But sometimes, really late at night, just as the seal woman had done, he would leave the croft and he'd walk down to the ocean and he'd look at the moonlight on the waves and he would search for that face of his one true love. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. That was beautiful. It is such a treat to hear you tell a story again. It's been a few years since I've had that treat. So it was really, really lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doreen. Yeah.
For anyone who wants to reach out to Caroline or anyone at Storytelling Alberta, you can contact us at info@storytellingalberta.com. And do check out our website. We have lots of offerings for our 40th anniversary. We have our ongoing tribute tales, and we have our other around the world tales for your listening and viewing enjoyment. And of course, we will be back again next week with another tale to tell. Thanks again, Caroline.
Thank you, Doreen.